Well, hello there, and welcome back to Infinite Inning episode 146. I am Stephen Goldman, then and now, 5 years ago now, your host. This is the first in a series of updated reissues of the Infinite Inning back catalog, inspired, necessitated by, one is half full, one is half empty, I guess, the verb, by some of the podcasting platforms basically requiring that I do that or lose these episodes. I've explained that in a number of our more recent discussions. This is episode, as I said, 146. We're up to 320-something, 328, I believe. So it's been a while. I've explained that in some of the episodes that begin with the number 32, and I'm not going to go into that here, except to say that it's not a bad thing. It's a good excuse to revisit some of these earlier stories that are now back numbers on the episode list and reflect on them a little bit now that time has passed. Episode 146 first came out on May 26th, 2020, so almost precisely 5 years ago now. That was at the height of the COVID pandemic, which has never really ended. And you'll hear me start out with the idea of compliance with pandemic restrictions and then quickly get into players who weren't compliant with baseball restrictions, including those heavy drinking old giants, Bugs Raymond, and the tragic Shufflin' Phil Douglas, which is not to say that Bugs Raymond wasn't a tragedy in and of himself, but Phil being later and better documented and having lived long enough to give, both at the moment of his fall and then in the years after, repeat versions of his testimony as to just what went wrong, that he's the rare old-time baseball figure who has a little interiority for us. We feel a bit more like we know him. It doesn't exculpate him for what he did, but he expressed his pain so often that we can understand that pretty easily. If someone like, let's say, Eddie Seacott expressed it, and I think he did a little, but he was mostly pretty reticent. Most of those Black Sox were either as a matter of character or group loyalty or fear of the organized crime figures who were involved in the fix, that they really weren't available to be reflective at all. You think Chick Gandil ever explained himself? No. That Phil was, I think, is part of the sadness of the story because he fell on such hard times as a result of being excluded from Major League Baseball, that his tale of woe, his regret, his pain was the only thing he had left to sell. But here I am kind of getting ahead of a story you're about to hear if you've not heard it before, or perhaps you have and you're revisiting the episode, and I thank you either way. After that, we talk about the outfielder turned catcher Don Padgett, a guy who could perhaps really hit, but Branch Rickey felt like he had to be a catcher, and that was that. That was, as you'll hear me say, one of my favorite baseball stories because so many cool things and kind of bad things happened. And with a lot of players, let's say Dick Wakefield, who started out with the Tigers, if I recall correctly, then got derailed by the war and maybe his own personality and other things. It's very much a case of, could this career have been very different if just a few breaks had gone the other way? That's the story of so many lives. And of course, with Don Padgett, there's a needed subtext. I mean, a necessary subtext for us, which is that not even Branch Rickey got them all right. Judas Priest. Yes, Branch, I'm sorry. The guest on this show, back when it first came out, was the author Brad Baluchian, who was promoting his book about traveling around the country and talking, or attempting to talk, to players who he had pulled from an old wax pack. It was an enjoyable book and a good discussion, although the main thing I think of when the book comes to mind now is the players who weren't in it. Gary Pettis wouldn't talk to him, for example. I always wonder why, and maybe Gary Pettis is just shy, but Gary Pettis has stayed in baseball a long time, and you think he'd be used to being accessible to writers, but apparently not. And I would have liked to hear from Gary Pettis, who, for one thing, played on an Angels team that was like 8 DHs in him, and he was the only guy on the team, or practically the only guy, with youth and speed. So if you look at the 1984 Angels, say, and you go down their list of players, they stole 80 bases as a team and were caught 51 times. The only player to steal more than 5 bases was Gary Pettis with 48. You start with the catcher and go down through the positions. I'm looking at Baseball Reference. Bob Boone, 3. Rod Carew, 4. Rod used to run more, but he was 38 at that time. Bobby Grich, 2. 5 caught stealing. Dick Schofield, 5. There's your 5. Doug DeCinces, 4. Brian Downing, former catcher, not. And so on. So Pettis is in center field between Downing and Fred Lynn, with occasional appearances by 30-something players like Reggie Jackson and Juan Beniquez, and he must have felt like he had to run miles on every single play to cover the gap. Alas, we did not get that kind of insight from Mr. Pettis. 5 Gold Gloves in his career for Gary Pettis. Not all of them for running pell-mell between aging Angels. Some of them were for running between aging Detroit Tigers on some of Sparky Anderson's more geriatric clubs. It was he who allowed the Tigers to push an aging Chet Lemon out of center to right. And although Chet never won a Gold Glove, he was a very good, underrated outfielder. I guess it's redundant to say never won a Gold Glove, underrated despite being quite good, and he could hit as well. For now, I don't plan to reissue the discussion parts of the show during this series of back issue revisits. Maybe I will at some point. What I'd like to do is find the time to go through all of, say, David Roth's appearances on the show or Cliff's, and find kind of a greatest hits package of all the really cool and funny and timeless things that they said. But that is a huge investment of time and would probably derail my being able to get new episodes out. So as always, I'm having to pick and choose as to what I do. We will get, during this reissue series, primarily the stories that make up the heart of the show. What you also won't hear is the discussion of classic old-time pop music that usually preceded and followed our ad breaks, because those are what prompted this reissue series. But again, not going to unpack that here. I've done that in the most recent episodes. You might argue that some of the COVID discussion that you're about to hear is now dated, but I disagree, for the simple reason that the way the current regime is tearing down most of our guardrails regarding public health means that, heaven forfend, we face another one of these crises. We are doomed. I happened to be reading, just for recreational value, although it was mostly depressing, a Reddit thread yesterday on worst things that happened to me at Disney World. Not me, but generic me or generic you. And many of them were, my husband and I caught norovirus and proceeded to wreck every bathroom on the property. Got COVID. And you know what? Next year, that thread is going to say got measles. We have to remember how to be a community, a people that pull together in times of crisis, find a consensus, instead of opening ourselves to being manipulated in ways that benefit people who seek power and only power, rather than a desire to help the community. And that can be true of figures on all sides of the political spectrum, or both ends. But right now it happens to be the one that is engaged in the denial of science and the denial of expertise in every single field. Hell, I'm surprised that they haven't come after on-base percentage yet. On-base percentage is DEI. Banned. It's worth noting, as we get into these stories again, that not everything was known to the public at that time. The managers, the reporters, tended to be euphemistic about things. Shufflin' Phil wasn't away from the team on an alcoholic binge, he was breaking training. One writer winkingly referred to him as having been addicted to hot dogs, and he wasn't around just now because he went off to Coney Island in search of hot dogs. It was only when Phil destroyed himself that his alcoholism had to be invoked directly. And even then, they didn't talk about it in terms of the disease that it was. It wasn't considered a disease at that time. It was either something that could be cured chemically or confronted purely by willpower and overcome. And both of those conceptions are about 75% magical thinking. Certainly, there's a place for both in overcoming addiction, but it's not just about abstinence. It's not just about taking some medication that at that time was just total snake oil. But it's also about recognizing the way that addiction changes one neurologically and then finding approaches that reckon with what has happened to a person on a purely organic level. Chastising them for being weak doesn't really help with that. Of course, you also have to have the desire to stop, and Shufflin' Phil Douglas very much did not see that he had the need to stop. Finally, the most fascinating thing about Phil Douglas is that he was banned from baseball for life for being corrupt, despite neither throwing a game nor offering to throw one. Yet his banishment makes sense, tragic as it was and is, but that is perhaps a story for another time. Here we go with episode 146. Is it possible that we're about to get an unwanted sequel? The bad news, everybody, in Breaking Training. Yes, it's not just children now, but everyone who are transgressive bears. That's my biker gang, the Transgressive Bears. As these words are gently transmogrified from sound waves into bits and bytes, Major League Baseball and the Players Union are still so busy arguing about money that they haven't found time to resolve the safety issues inherent in playing again. And I wonder to what extent they're aware that any plan that tries to compel player behavior runs up against a whole lot of history. There's an old joke about a ball player breaking curfew. I mean, there are 1,000 old jokes about ball players breaking curfew. This one could really apply to almost anyone who's out past when they're supposed to be and for the wrong reasons. I think it originates with ball players, but maybe one of you will tell me it started with the Holy Roman Empire in the year 927. It's not even much of a joke. A manager sits in his team's hotel lobby late at night waiting to catch players coming in after curfew, and minutes or perhaps hours later, an obviously inebriated player comes tottering in, and disgusted, the manager says, "Drunk again." And the player says, "Yeah, me too." Players have been breaking curfew for as long as there have been ball players. They're young men. They want to do what young men often do, which is drink and have Congress with women in whatever way you might want to define Congress. Casey Stengel, who knew something about late nights as a bachelor outfielder in New York City, said, "You gotta learn that if you don't get it by midnight, chances are you ain't gonna get it, and if you do, it ain't worth it." Again, I leave it to you to define it, but we're all adults here, and I think we know Casey was referring to the rare 1918 inverted Jenny postage stamp, every boy's dream. Managers used to set up bellboys and elevator operators to catch truant ball players. They'd give them a ball and say, "If you see any players come in here after midnight, ask them for an autograph." And then the manager would get up in the morning, look at the ball, and see who had inadvertently confessed, or they'd place a coach in the lobby or themselves and just snag them as they came in. Or they'd go around knocking on doors and do an actual bed check. There are so many stories of players in bed with all their clothes on, having just made it in time to pull the blankets up and fake having been asleep, having come in off the fire escape, or as the Beatles sang, through the bathroom window. And as we'll see on next week's show, that applied to the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League too. As we're learning now, as we're relearning, no one likes being told what to do, even if it is best for them, even if it is a matter of healthfulness, whether because you have to report to the ballpark at 10 for a 1 o'clock start, or you just don't want to make yourself or those around you ill. All that is very reasonable, and yet, though we know better, the outdoors call to us, or as Babe Ruth once sang, accompanied by a sweet ukulele, how you going to keep them down on the farms after they've seen the brothels of Chicago? Major League Baseball's preliminary reopening plan relies on a number of tenuous assumptions, including that they'll have total compliance when it comes to traveling ball players quarantining themselves in hotels. Not that we've seen total compliance anywhere. And when you're talking about a sample of the population as large as baseball will need to keep the game going, we are talking about well over 1,000 players, and that's before we get to coaches and trainers and bat boys and television production people. It's just unrealistic to think that someone in that group won't break discipline. Think about ball players in the cocaine scandals of the 1980s. There was a red line, or maybe I should say white line, and they knew it. They knew it was there, and yet many of them crossed it anyway. High levels of temptation and the low levels of impulse control inherent in young people make for a bad combination. Now, I don't want to sound pessimistic here. Virus affairs are getting better in some parts of the United States, such as New York and New Jersey. We're going to start loosening things up, and we'll see what happens. There is inevitably going to be a resurgence of cases in some places. There are parts of the country like Florida and Texas where they're reopening amidst rising case numbers. So far, they haven't paid a price for that, and maybe they won't. Maybe somehow the logic of transmission will suspend itself for whatever reason. I hope so. But we don't know that. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty about what will happen once you start the game back up. And I'm talking now about people intentionally violating sequester in a way that might lead to infection, but there are also all kinds of possible accidental infections that might happen just through random happenstance, and that's impossible to control for. I'm not necessarily asking baseball to control for it, but the more people that you take into the group, into the circle, the more exterior contacts or external contacts that they have. That's why we are now saying in many parts of the country, well, you can have restaurants, but at 25% capacity, or you can have church services, but at 50% with social distancing. Everyone has to be spaced out. And it's not necessarily that spending an hour in a closed room with 10 people is automatically safer than spending it in a closed room with 100. It's just that you are reducing your sample size so that you dip your ladle into the bucket of people, so to speak. And if you come up with 10, you're less likely to catch a spreader than if you are dipping in and pulling up 100. And epidemiological studies throughout the crisis have shown that a disproportionate amount of the disease is spread or has been spread by just a few people, so-called super spreaders. So how do you ensure complete compliance so that a ball player doesn't go to that Missouri Great Clip Salon where infected stylists were cutting hair and exposed, I've seen different numbers, over 100 or 150 people, and then come back to his team and kill the manager with a sneeze? Baseball teams used to use detectives to surveil their players. That was one way. It wasn't very effective, and I don't imagine they would do that now. But the practice itself shows, well, mainly it shows the pernicious paternalism these employers used to have to think they could police their employees' off hours. But the fact that they felt it was necessary shows the extent to which young people will get in trouble. If you think about it, Ed Delahanty's death was a failure of surveillance. When you leave a baseball player alone, he'll just get drunk and belligerent and then fall to his death off of a high bridge and be swept over Niagara Falls. It happens every day. And how can you win a pennant with that happening 9 times a season? You'd hit the replacement level pretty fast and also have to go to too many funerals. There are endless stories of teams having, to borrow from Preston Sturges, vulgar footpads sluicing after their players. I love that phrase. They span the game's earliest days through, say, the 1950s. One of the oldest stories about that features the famously self-destructive catcher King Kelly, who was from the same period as Delahanty, actually. His team had him followed while he roamed the darkened streets from tavern to tavern, and the next day, his manager read him the detective's report. He read the whole team reports on all of them, and he was saying, and then at 3 a.m., you were in a bar drinking lemonade, and Kelly was deeply offended. It was straight whiskey. I never drank a lemonade at that hour in my life. There's a similar story involving John McGraw and the pitcher Arthur Bugs Raymond, who really was a sad, sad story. Directly and indirectly, alcoholism killed him at a very young age. This was at the beginning of the 20th century. McGraw read Raymond a report of his previous evening's activities. In the first place, you had 2 beers and went to the lunch counter where you ate 3 onions. In the second place, 2 ryes with beer chasers, some cheese and crackers, and 3 onions. In the third place, 1 rye, 2 beers, and an onion. In the fourth, 2 ryes, 2 onions, and Raymond was incensed. That's a dirty lie. I didn't have but 2 onions all evening. I don't know if there was a time in American history where people just ate onions as if they were apples. I don't know if they were sweet like Fidelia's. I'm very confused about all this, but it's the same story. No, I was drinking, not eating. 70 years or so later, in May 1954, Phillies second baseman Granny Hamner was driving home one night when he thought he noticed a car following him. He pulled into his own driveway and he waited. The car circled the block several times, slowing in front of his house, and Hamner did what most of us would do and called the police. They arrived in time to question one Charles Leland of Delaware, who insisted he had followed Hamner home by mistake. I was looking for someone else. When they checked his car, though, they noticed he was illegally carrying 2 handguns, so they arrested him. Possibly he was also carrying a bag of onions for snacking during the long stakeout. I'm very confused about this onions thing. Phillies owner Bob Carpenter admitted that Leland had lied. He was there to watch Hamner. This is no case of mistaken identity, Carpenter said. It was a case of my employing a detective agency to check on some of my players. Most major league clubs follow the same policy. Each year, I have checked on my players, both at home and on the road, so I could be assured that our rules of midnight curfew after day games and 2 a.m. curfew after night games would be observed. I have no suspicions of the behavior or the performance of my players, nor do I doubt their sincerity and heartfelt actions in every game. I merely want a ball club that will always be physically and mentally prepared to play the 154 games that are necessary in a pennant race. I'm surprised he didn't add morally prepared as well. I mean, if you don't have doubts about your players, then what the heck are you surveilling them for? But he went on, if our past checks revealed that a player was not observing the curfew, we called him in and talked it over in a friendly manner. We told him that he didn't want to delve into his private life, but that the curfew was set up to ensure the players being in shape to play their best. How do you have that conversation in a friendly manner? We've been watching you, Richie. Oh, yes, we've been watching you, and we know what you've been up to, Richie. Don't try to conceal it. We know. We'll get to Granny Hamner's reaction to being surveilled right after this quick break. Appropriately, Hamner was pretty annoyed by all this, at least for a moment. I resent this and I intend to do something about it. This stuff of treating me and the other ball players like 2-year-olds is going to wreck our club. We can win the pennant. We have a better team than in 50 when we won. But this uncalled for Gestapo tactics will ruin our chances if it's not cut out right away. He demanded a trade. Carpenter apologized both publicly and privately, and he backed down, but at no point did the Phillies say they would stop the practice of watching their players. In fact, they insisted they retain the right to do so and should do so, and Hamner, setting the players' cause back 100 years, agreed. I wasn't mad at being followed, I merely resented the way it was done. And the first story that came out, which gave the impression to the fans and public that the club had reasons to follow me other than the curfew, was misleading. The curfew is a wonderful thing, and if I were a manager, I would be even stricter with a curfew than our club is. I think I've said too much already, and the sooner it's all forgotten, the better. I have no intention of taking it up with Robin Roberts, our player representative, and the men as a matter for negotiation with the club. And yet, he said later, he heard taunts from the fans like, "Who's trailing it tonight, Granny? Going out on the town tonight after the game?" They had wrecked his reputation with an inept detective, and for the sake of knowing what he was doing in his private life, which was none of their business and never had been. In fact, sometimes detectives, having been assigned to a fruitless pursuit of an otherwise innocent player. There's a famous story of the Yankees assigning a detective to Tony Kubek, Bobby Richardson, and the pitcher Bobby Shantz, and he followed them to the YMCA where they drank milk, shot pool, and played ping pong. And there's some question in my mind of whether they had made him and figured they'd put one over on him. But in general, they were just clean-cut kids anyway, and it was a waste of time. It was just pure. I don't even want to say that it was an unnecessary overreach, given that those players had never been suspected of anything and never would be, but I don't want to imply that it was okay to surveil the Billy Martins and Mickey Mantles either. If you felt that they were not in condition, then say so, and I think they frequently did. But no employer has a right to know what you're doing in your off hours or who you're doing it with. That is a very dangerous and frankly un-American way of doing things. But detectives can't get paid following players into ice cream parlors or the YMCA, and sometimes they would engage in outright entrapment, manufacture situations in which the ball players would get in trouble. One of the most notable instances of this happened in 1922. The Yankees held spring training in New Orleans that year, which was a really bad idea, to be fair about everything. They could make more money holding exhibitions in a major city as opposed to Shreveport or wherever they had been before, Baton Rouge, but at the risk of exposing their players to many more temptations than they would have had at a more isolated location. Manager Miller Huggins also cut workouts back to once a day, which was a tactical error in which it allowed the players more free time in which to explore the city and its many vices. The writers were usually discreet in reporting the off-field activities of the players in those days, but the Yankees were so public in their partying that soon there were headlines like Yankees training on scotch. And this was during Prohibition, by the way. And so the team hired a detective, but not one whose job was simply to spy on the players. This guy was a full-fledged infiltrator. He introduced himself to them as a traveling salesman, and he successfully ingratiated himself with them. He even told them that one of the beat writers was actually a plant. That guy, he's the detective. And so one night, he led several of them, including Babe Ruth, to a party at a speakeasy. He then produced a photographer so that he might have a souvenir of these wonderful friends, the New York Yankees, that he had collected. The players obediently lined up to have their photo taken, and the next day, the salesman had disappeared, but the photograph remained in the hands of general manager Ed Barrow and owner Jacob Rupert. The picture still exists. You can find it in some history books on the New York Yankees. The most pernicious example of surveilling a ball player that I can think of, and one that really helps put the lie to the efficaciousness of the whole thing, involves Shufflin' Phil Douglas, another severe alcoholic who pitched for the Giants. This is one of many stories it's hard to believe I haven't done more than allude to during the run of this show, but Phil was a troubled guy and a heavy, I'll say it a third time, heavy drinker. He was a legalized spitballer who pitched in the National League from the teens into the early 20s before getting himself banned for life for threatening to throw a game to get revenge for the way Giants manager John McGraw had treated him. And how had McGraw treated him? Well, first he verbally abused him in front of his teammates for being a drunk. Then he hired detectives to follow him. Since being shamed for breaking the rules didn't stop Douglas from drinking, he hired a guy to babysit him. The problem was he and the babysitter got to liking each other, and then they started drinking together, so that actually redoubled the problem rather than solving it. Then he used old-timer Jesse Burkett, a future Hall of Fame outfielder then coaching for the Giants, as yet another babysitter, but a more sullen and antisocial one. Burkett's nickname was the Crab, so he was kind of the antithesis of a party animal, and there was zero chance that he and Douglas would like each other enough that they would start tipping them back as a unit. But Douglas was able to ditch him and go on a huge bender, at which point Burkett, two detectives, and the police kidnapped Douglas and threw him against his will and without his consent into a sanitarium, holding him for 5 days, forcing him to dry out, and they refused to disclose to his wife where he was for the first 4 days of that period. McGraw also billed him for the medical services and then fined him for being away from the team because he had been held prisoner. By him. And it was only then that Douglas, in what I presume was another severely inebriated and depressed state, offered via the mails to throw games. And I'm not saying
that it was forgivable, but it certainly is understandable because he was at the end of a kind of rope, having literally been abducted and tortured by his team. It's a sad story. We'll do it more justice some other time. But suffice it to say for now that if someone is determined to break training, they will. And that goes not just for alcoholics like Phil Douglas, but every ball player who, as Casey said of Don Larson when he drove his car into a tree in the twilight hours of spring training in '56, was either out too late or out too early. I'm Stephen Goldman. I am so giddy, Shakespeare wrote, expectation whirls me round, the imaginary relish is so sweet that it enchants my senses. Keyword, imaginary. Words that should be replaced. Instead of enchants my senses, it should be overwhelms. Optimism is a fool's game. When the stakes are life and death, it's far better to hope for the best and expect the worst. So cry, play ball, and hold your breath for the rest of the season when you're gaming out the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show. I hope you are well in these trying times when it is difficult to stay well, and there are those out there trying actively to make it more difficult for you. Well, that's starting on a happy note. I'm recording this 2 days after the New York Times devoted its entire front page to 1,000 one-line obituaries of those who have lost their lives to COVID-19. I forced myself to read it, and it had the desired effect. It changed those victims from statistics into stories, which is to say, into human beings. And by forced myself, I mean that it was a heavy undertaking to feel all of that accumulated loss. And if you have any empathy at all, it's easy to know that. Intuitively, you understand that underlying all these numbers that are totting up every single day, there are actual mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, friends who are now gone forever, but you don't dwell on it because it's too painful to dwell on it. But that's self-indulgent, and we don't have that luxury right now. There were many 90-something people on those lists, and I know there are some who want to write them off, but we're not God. We don't get to decide when someone has no vitality, no value to those who love them. Well, I have no doubt that the Times sorted its list so that younger victims were given disproportionate space. There were plenty of victims under 90, under 70, under 60, and I weep to think of how their absence is going to ripple forward in time and affect everyone they knew who, should they survive the pandemic, and most of us will if we're lucky, knock wood, they will go through the years without the presence of those people, without their laughter, without their good advice, without their comforting shoulders to cry on. That leaving, that leave-taking, it doesn't exist in a single moment. It echoes for forever and stretches out for the rest of the lives of those who leave behind. And yes, they will become used to it. They will become inured to the pain, so they won't weep every time they think of that person, but they often will. And it's hard enough to lose someone to a random fate, to age, to cancer, to any of a number of diseases that we do not have a forewarning of, that could not have been prevented. So many things are invisible to us or asymptomatic until they do us in. And so, though that loss, whatever their age, is painful, you can rationalize it. You can say it was his or her time. And even that is difficult. I was watching, as kind of sidecar preparation to next week's episode, when I will be discussing a new book on the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. I alluded to it earlier. There was a documentary that just came out on Netflix called A Secret Love, and it's about a pair of women who had been together for about 65 years at the time that the documentary was shot, and they had met during a time when that was not acceptable for two women to be publicly together, although, of course, some were and some always had been. But this was at the turn of the 40s and 50s. And the reason that it was relevant was that one of the pair, Terry Donahue, was a player in the league. And what I wasn't wholly prepared for was that the documentary was less about the terms under which they met or the society within which they met, although it covered all that, but was more balanced towards their inevitable parting and end-of-life issues. These two women were so beloved, particularly Ms. Donahue, that her family, even though you could see throughout the course of this film, and it was shot over a period of years, you could see her physically decline throughout, and perhaps emotionally decline too, throughout the course of the film. They loved her so much that the idea of losing her, even though it was pretty clear that if we do have a time, it was her time, and maybe she understood that it was her time, was devastating. And I guess that's not a new idea. I can think of plenty of people in my life. In fact, I can think of my own grandmother, who I was reminded of because, although she was a very vital person right to the end of her life, for a brief period before she did leave us, she had kind of a 1,000-yard stare, a sense that she was finished, I think. And maybe that's just depression. And maybe you can be in your mid-80s and in a state of clear physical decline and still be raring to go, eager to stay. She wasn't. My point is that when everything is telling you that it's inevitable that something is going to happen, and this is the time that it should happen, and even the person who is going to be most impacted by this is saying to you in many ways that this is the time that it should happen, it will still tear your heart out and stomp it. And so imagine then if you had the sense that this was avoidable. And many of these deaths have been. And if we had met this thing on the beaches like we would an invading horde, we would be far better off. And I shouldn't say that we could have done that necessarily, because every country fumbled this to one extent or another, or most did. But there was still a period after the beachhead, but before it got everywhere, where we could have been more aggressive and spared so much loss. And I've only talked about the people left behind and the impact on them. It is, of course, impossible to estimate the loss to the victims themselves, the deprivation of the gift of life, love, enjoyment, accomplishment that they would have had in the coming years, or might have had. On last week's show, I alluded to Stalin's line that one death is a tragedy and 1,000 deaths is a statistic. We cannot let that be the case now. So I hope you will take a look at what the Times put together and hold those people in your hearts. We have, all of us, let those people down so very badly. And keep in mind, as the numbers continue to rise and past 100,000, that in many ways we're still failing in our duty to each other. In short, let's take care of each other. We all want to strip off our masks and maybe a lot of other layers and go to the beach. We all want to, but most of us are not doing that. And I commend each and every one of us who has not. As for those who have, some have been misled and some are frankly evil, and I have no patience for either. But we will all have to have charity for them when they or their loved ones become ill as a result of their actions. Shifting gears to the jejune, the trite. I had two things up at Baseball Prospectus on Tuesday. One is the second of a series of stories in which I bridge all of time, one observation after another. In this one, I went from Cap Anson to Mookie Betts in 7 steps. I think in the prior one, I had gone from Babe Ruth to Mike Trout. I also have a new baseball song in Roger Cormier's story about the soon-to-be-extinct Daytona Tortugas. It's part of a whole series of multimedia presentations on the minor league teams Major League Baseball has marked for extinction. It's called The Baseball Player's Honeymoon, and I very much hope you enjoy it. I'd hoped they were going to cover it, but instead, Roger put my demo up, so I feel a little bit undressed in public, but I hope you will forgive the cracks and creaks and enjoy this bit of amateurism on my part. Speaking of enjoyment, I want to thank new Patreon members Duncan and Dustin for supporting the show. We called out their name in the end credits too. That's how much we enjoyed their coming aboard. And for all those who support the show, whether by contributing or listening or just telling people about it, we thank you just as much. And I know I say this so often it must sound boring or like some faux show business put on, but all I have ever wanted to do in my life is edify and entertain, to tell stories. And I am so deeply appreciative that you have embraced my doing that for you here, and you have given me each week for almost 3 years now some of your precious time.
Speaking of precious time, now is when we are obligated to pause for a quick break. But on the other side, I have one more tale for you, that of a catcher who really didn't want to be one. Sounds like it could be a good children's story. There are definitely some lessons in there, I can promise you that.
I've wanted to tell this story for a long time, a tale of missed opportunity and a demonstration of an adage we have cited often as sung by Bob Dylan in Subterranean Homesick Blues: don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. So much of life is contingent, which is to say the universe laughs at our plans. Simultaneously, it is also true that, as Branch Rickey said, luck is the residue of design. You can slant things a little with careful planning, but sometimes bad luck could be the residue of Branch Rickey. That's the case in this story, and in part because of his intervention in this player's career, that career didn't really happen, or it didn't happen the way it might have. The other thing that deflected him was a world war, which was not his fault or Branch Rickey's fault, that I can prove anyway. It was just an accident of timing, in the same way that if you happen to be living in what would become Germany during the 30 Years' War, you were doomed. There's an incredible but depressing book that came out several years ago called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, and it makes clear that if you happen to live in the Ukraine and it was somewhere between 1925 and 1945, you had a stupidly high chance of failing to live out your natural lifespan. If Stalin didn't get you, then Hitler did. Again, that's no one's fault. Did you ever read the Sandman graphic novel series by Neil Gaiman? In those stories, death is personified as a young woman, and early on we follow her about as she makes her rounds collecting souls as they finish out their time here. And there's a panel I think of often where she is lifting a baby out of its crib, and the baby says, "That's it? That's all I get?" And she says, "I'm afraid so." It's not fair or unfair. It's just the way that it is. My story isn't nearly that heavy. I realize we've been heavy today, but those are the thoughts that it provoked in me. The player who was damaged as a combination of one of Branch Rickey's few really bad ideas and World War II was Don Padgett of North Carolina. An outfielder, he was hoovered into the massive Cardinals farm system out of Lenoir Rhine College of Hickory as a 21-year-old in 1935. He was 6 feet tall, maybe 200 pounds, and pretty clearly a corner outfielder in terms of his fielding abilities. He threw right-handed but swung lefty, and he pulled the ball. But what kind of offensive potential did he have? Well, that's a complicated question, but the whole story hinges on that. It took him a couple of years to produce in the minors. He didn't strike out much, but he was also hitting in the 260s and 270s without much pop. In 1936, though, he had a good 81 games for the Columbus Redbirds of the American Association, hitting .329, and that was enough to make him a bona fide prospect and get him a shot at major league playing time in 1937. The Cardinals were in an in-between place at that point in the 1930s. They had won the 1934 World Series and just missed winning another pennant in 1935. They were enduring a little 5-year trough, a transition period where they were sorting through the old Gas House Gang players and bringing along the next generation like Stan Musial and Country Slaughter. And when it was over, they would be incredible, winning 4 pennants in 5 years from 1942 through 1946 and taking 3 World Series. Padgett was part of that sorting. The Cardinals already had a potent left fielder in Ducky Medwick and a center fielder, Terry Moore, who was a good glove and he'd eventually hit, though he wasn't there yet, so he was in a precarious place. Right field was more unsettled, and even in the championship season, the Cardinals were weak there. Pepper Martin had played there in 1936, but he was also kind of a third baseman where the Cardinals weren't strong either, and he tended to get hurt a lot, so they did need help there. Padgett hit his way onto the Major League team that year, but spent most of the first 2 months on the bench biding his time. Moore injured his knee in early June and missed about 3 weeks, and then occasional time for another couple of weeks after that, which created the first opportunity for Padgett to play regularly, with Martin moving to center and Padgett taking over right field. And then when Moore was ready to play again, manager Frankie Frisch left him on the bench and kept Padgett out there. Later, Martin got hurt too, so playing time opened up for both of them. This isn't part of Padgett's story, but I wanted to read you this news item from the St. Louis Star and Times because it shows just how much times have changed. Pepper Martin hurt, will be unable to play for a few days. Pepper Martin, the Cards' versatile outfielder-infielder, will be out of action for the next few days with a torn lateral ligament in his right leg, suffered during yesterday's game with the Reds as he slid into third baseman Lou Riggs after tripling in the 4th inning. Now, if that happened today, what kind of injured list stay would you bid for that injury? 60 days, right? I think at least that. Double it if we're talking about Aaron Judge or Byron Buxton. But we'd be wrong. Doc Weaver, Cardinal trainer, did not believe the injury serious, however, and expects Pepper to be back in the game within 3 or 4 days. He gets those all the time, Weaver said, but he gets over them pretty quickly. Pepper has trick knees that way. The injury is much like that a football player suffers when he's clipped from the side by a tackle. Sure it is. He missed 38 of the next 40 games. He was hitting .311 and slugging .498 when he went out. He had a powerless .255 in the 16 games remaining in the season at that point. They should have left him on the shelf. Today they probably would have. So Padgett got to play, and he was pretty good. He hit .314 with a .357 on-base percentage and a .457 slugging percentage. He finished 11th in the league in batting average. He was only 3rd on the Cardinals because Medwick won a batting title at .374 and the Triple Crown and the MVP award, and first baseman Johnny Mize finished 2nd at .364. If Padgett had the ability to play center field, he simply would have taken Terry Moore's job. But although the Cardinals thought about it and gave him a couple of chances to play there, it was definitely not his position. And that created a problem for Branch Rickey because not only was his outfield crowded, he knew he had an even better outfield prospect coming along in Enos Slaughter. First base might have been a possibility if they didn't already have Mize, who was just insanely productive. His career averages with the Cardinals, every year, were .336, .419, and .600. Some of us have the talent, but not the timing, and Padgett was that guy. He was blocked by a future Hall of Famer in left, a future Hall of Famer in right, and a future Hall of Famer at first base. And so Rickey, baseball genius, hit on a solution: stuff Padgett behind the plate, a position at which the Cards were weak. Legend has it that the first Padgett heard about this, because no one asked him, was 2 days after Christmas, when a crate filled with catching gear was delivered to his house, followed 2 days later. It's funny that 2 days later, imagine Padgett sitting there going, "What's this?" But 2 days later, he got a letter from Rickey suggesting that he take that gear and get out in the backyard and practice. But that's not true. I mean, the crate might have happened, but the move was publicly discussed by manager Frankie Frisch as early as September of 1937, during the regular season. Possibly Padgett wanted to pretend he hadn't heard because he hated the idea. "I can't catch," he told Rickey, "and I don't want to." Rickey temporized. "Learn how to catch, and you will share in a World Series melon with this club in a year." The Cardinals designated a coach, Mike Gonzalez, a former catcher, to teach Padgett. And before I get into what Gonzalez said about him, I want to note that his real name was not Mike but Miguel. He was a Cuban immigrant. He spoke with a thick accent. He was the guy who coined the ubiquitous baseball description, good field, no hit. And he wasn't being clever. That was just the way that he expressed himself with the command of English that he had. And it's fine to notice that. And we know that with Yogi Berra or Casey Stengel or Sparky Anderson or any ball player who had an idiosyncratic way of expressing himself, that we comment on those things and we enjoy them because they bring more color to the game. But what is not okay, at least from a present-day perspective, is that the newspapers, when they reported what Gonzalez had to say, would render it in this pidgin English that makes him sound like he's practicing for a voiceover role in a Speedy Gonzalez cartoon. Who knows? Maybe this guy could have been a great manager if only people had taken him seriously. But instead, his accent was treated as high comedy. And so I have cleaned up as best I can some of the quote that I'm about to give you. This is what he said about tutoring Padgett. He hit on the problem right away. I see him like this. If Don like catch enough, maybe she can do easy. But if he no like, I told you, you waste plenty time, and he never learn catch pop flies in low pitch. And that is one trouble I see. Maybe she don't like catching enough. And she didn't. And Gonzalez's coaching made him feel more discouraged. So did a little informal tutoring from Yankee star Bill Dickey. Put me back in the outfield, Padgett begged Frisch. After watching that guy, I know I'll never be anything but a clown behind the plate. Frisch wasn't wholly on board with the position change anyway. It was much more Rickey's idea than his. And that spring, the spring of 1938, he had Terry Moore moving from center field to third base and Don Gutteridge moving from third base to second base. And Frisch wasn't happy with any of that. Still, he tried to defend it in the press. He thought back to a hero of the 34 championship series, Bill Delancey. Delancey is another really tragic story. He made the Cardinals as a 22-year-old and split the catching job with the veteran Virgil Spud Davis. Delancey hit .316 with a .414 on base and a .565 slugging in 93 games, and passed Davis in the postseason, catching all 7 games of the World Series and homering in Game 5. After that, though, serious health problems quickly truncated his career, and he died at 35. It didn't take Bill Delancey long to learn about Major League catching, Frisch said. Delancey could whop that ball, too. We couldn't have won that pennant without his catching. Well, Padgett can learn just as quickly. He's seen the hitters, and it won't take long for him to know what it's all about if he can handle the mechanical part of the job. And from what he's shown in practice, I'm very much encouraged. But Frisch was remembering incorrectly. Delancey had been catching in the minors all along. There was no conversion that happened there. Padgett was made to catch 2 games a day so as to speed up his learning curve. He was virtually never seen without the gear on. Pepper Martin asked him, "How do you sleep in those things?" He proved to be adept at calling a game and made strong throws to second base. Pop-ups, though, were an adventure, and balls in the dirt inevitably got by him. Of course, you can't make a catcher in 2 weeks, Rickey explained. It takes time, and if Don does catch this year, it may be some time before he gets on to all the fine points of the position. But he has made progress, decided progress. He likes to play the position. Actually, he liked it so much that when Frisch attempted to move Padgett from right field to catcher as part of a late-inning switch in one game, Padgett wouldn't come in. He just folded his arms and stayed in the outfield. Not going. Rickey was a great man, but he was no saint. He could lie as well as anybody. And even if Padgett had liked catching, Frisch didn't like him catching. He started 4 games behind the plate all of 1938, none prior to late September, when the Cardinals were 1 out of the race, and perhaps not coincidentally, 2, after Frisch had been fired and replaced on an interim basis by Gonzalez. For Padgett, the season was just a total failure. He saved his numbers with a hot fall, but he'd hit only .271 with 8 home runs. Worse, Rickey recommitted to the catching. If Blades can keep that fellow behind the bat for 100 games this year, he said, referring to new manager Ray Blades in 1939, we'll win the pennant. Well, he didn't, and they didn't. But it wasn't a total loss, the opposite, in fact. The 1939 experiment was delayed for a while when Padgett dislocated his shoulder by falling on his left elbow while rounding second base in a spring training game. There was no formal use of the disabled list or injured list then. Padgett was kept on the roster and was restricted to occasional pinch hitting appearances for the first 8 weeks of the season. And while he sat and watched other better, more productive outfielders play, he recommitted to catching, or more accurately, committed to it for the first time. I'm going to make it, accident or no accident, he said. I didn't care about it all last year, but I like it fine now, and I think I can do everything. You know, I wasn't a hell of an outfielder, I know that, but I think I can whip this catching business. When he did finally get back in the lineup in mid-June, he went nuts at the bat. By the end of July, he was hitting .445 in 120 plate appearances. He cooled down only slightly after that, hitting only .358 the rest of the way. People really cared about the batting title back then, and he got a lot of attention because the question was, could he qualify to win it? There wasn't a plate appearance qualification then. It was 100 games. He didn't have enough time to make that. He only got into 92. Mize got the official batting title for a full season at .349, but Padgett finished with one of the highest batting averages in Cardinals history, albeit only in 257 plate appearances. He hit .399. And now he was a star, but only for a minute. As Brooklyn sports writer Tommy Holmes later wrote, Padgett was a victim of one of Branch Rickey's less brilliant ideas. Padgett was about as home behind the plate as a street cleaner would be at a dansant at the Ritz, but Rickey kept insisting that his weakness as a catcher was merely a frame of mind. In 1940, Padgett's defense was no better, and he was also weakened by tonsillitis, so he didn't hit. Blades was fired and replaced by Billy Southworth, who had the same opinion of Padgett as a catcher that Frisch had, and he was less pliant than Blades and stuck to his guns in terms of not putting him behind the plate. Padgett had started to lose playing time even before the change. His batting average had dropped 120 points, and that was the main thing that people noticed. They weren't thinking about on-base or slugging percentage at that time, and Padgett's were actually fairly decent, but since his batting average had gone down and his catching was still miserable, he slipped behind Mickey Owen, who ironically is remembered for a major defensive miscue in the 1941 World Series, into the backup catcher role. And as you know, backup catchers never play, just in case a meteor crushes the starting catcher and the team hasn't already vented him for some other purpose, and then they have to use the emergency catcher. So Southworth did not put Padgett in a game in the outfield all season long. And then, to add injury to all this insult, late in the season, he split a finger, and I'm not sure if that means a break or a ripped fingernail, a severely ripped fingernail, but either way, he missed the last 2 weeks of the season. Years later, it was reported that he was not hurt, he was benched, and that was because the Cardinals were upset at him for a bonehead play that he made against the Cubs late in the season. Supposedly, the Cubs had runners on second and third, or just third, and the call from the manager was to issue an intentional walk. So Padgett jumps out from behind the plate to receive the wide pitch, and the Cubs' third base coach shouted, "Hey, Don," or some such thing, and Padgett looked, and the pitch sailed past him about head high and went all the way to the backstop, the Cubs scoring the winning run. I have tried to find that game, and I can't. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but the Cardinals went 14-8 against the Cubs that year, and Padgett didn't do anything special in the few losses that were close, especially late in the season. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but the Cardinals also didn't need a special reason to bench him. There was just nowhere to put him. As New York Times columnist John Kieran observed the following spring, he used to be an outfielder and a hitter. As a catcher last season, he wasn't much of a hitter, or much of a catcher either, if it comes to that. He doesn't like the job. He was in it with both feet, but no part of his heart. His heart was in the outfield all the time. They had him shackled behind the plate with a lot of cumbersome upholstery draped over his manly form. He finished at .242 with a .321 on base and a .388 slugging percentage, and the next season was much the same, but with less catching and more work as a part-time left fielder. Medwick had been traded, but he had been replaced by yet another good young prospect, Johnny Hopp. So he sat, and he slumped, or vice versa, and Rickey finally realized that, in his words, Padgett has to follow the rabbit every day. He can't pick up a cold trail. That is, he had to play every day to be effective. And like many of us, he tried to eat his way out of his sorrow. As one sports writer observed, because he didn't work regularly, Padgett put on beef. He used to be reasonably fast, but now is a bit of a percheron as a ball player. If you don't know what a percheron is, it is the biggest damned horse you've ever seen. It's not built for speed. It's built for long-haul trucking. I'm serious. Look it up. They are gigantic. They tower over people. They are the size of small buildings. You have been in convenience stores smaller than a percheron. Due in large part to aggressive expansionist fascism, Rickey's theory about Padgett needing to play every day was never tested. Not then, not till now. He wasn't going to bother anyway. Defeated, he traded Padgett to the Dodgers for a couple of fringe prospects and a few dollars during the 1941 winter meetings. As soon as Padgett showed up at spring training, manager Leo DeRocher was asked, will he catch? It was a logical question because, A, the Cardinals had gone through all of that struggle trying to make him into a catcher, and the Dodgers were just as crowded with good outfielders, star outfielders, as the Cardinals had been. They had been the ones to acquire Medwick, and they also had Pete Reissue, Dixie Walker, Augie Gallen, Johnny Rizzo, and more. Only Medwick is a Hall of Famer, but at their best, all of them were at that level or close to it. But no, catching was still not Padgett's way off the bench. Padgett is our right fielder, Leo said. Don can really do a job out there. He's batting left, and I won't ask him to catch. That has ruined his last 2 seasons. It is very hard to understand why the Dodgers were pushing Padgett towards right field when Walker, the incumbent, had just had back-to-back top 10 finishes in the MVP voting, but we'll never know because Pearl Harbor happened, and Padgett was in the Navy before spring training was over. He initially joined the famous Great Lakes baseball team under manager Mickey Cochran, but he didn't stay. He spent most of the next 4 years in a submarine, lurking beneath the Pacific. There's not much room for exercise on a sub, and he gained even more weight. He wasn't demobbed until January 1946. Baseball Reference lists his official weight as 190, but when he left the Navy, he was huge. When a columnist suggested he was now working to convert himself into a Shanty Hogan model catcher, he replied, go on. I only weighed 231 this morning, and I've taken 15 pounds off since I've been down here. In the end, he couldn't come back. He had been 29 when he had last played. It had been years since he had been good, and now he was 33. The Dodgers gave him 19 games behind the plate and then sold him to the Braves. He was a backup catcher and pinch hitter there and with the Phillies into 1948, and that was it. He played his way back down, catching for good Oakland Oaks teams under Charlie Dressen, and hitting, by the way, but that was the Pacific Coast League. Eventually, he went back to North Carolina. Very little has been written about him. He married a school teacher. It doesn't seem like he had any children, or at least none who survived him. His obituary mentions that he was a member of the Association of Ball Players of America and was associated with Diamond Quality Motors in High Point after his retirement from baseball. He was a member of the Loyal Order of the Moose and a member of the Emmanuel Lutheran Church. In the Bill James Historical Abstract, in each edition of it, he has a category for each decade. Could I try this career over? And in at least one of those editions, Padgett is listed in that spot for the 1940s. I don't think that's right, though, that if Padgett hadn't been moved behind the plate, he would have been a good player or even a great one. I think it's more likely that he was one of those hitters who put too many balls in play. He rarely struck out or walked, and had he been left alone in some years, as in 1939, he would have lucked into a high batting average, not 399 high, but 300 high, and in a lot of other years, he would have been what he turned out to be, a 250 hitter with not a lot of peripherals to goose that average into productivity. Yet we have to acknowledge that people who were actually there shared James's opinion. In Robert Creamer's excellent book, Baseball in 41, he remembered during spring training in 41, an old-timer watching Padgett said, "Rickey seldom makes mistakes, but when he does, it's a beaut. It's a caution how much he messed this boy up." We need that expression to make a comeback. It's a caution. And it is. It's a caution to remember that great men are still imperfect men. I don't know if Rickey was a genius or just a baseball genius and innovator in his field, but I do know that in his long career, he made more than one misjudgment. And that's all you really need to know here. Well, two things. The lesser caution is that players sometimes have weirdly distorted performances in small samples. That's what happened when Padgett hit .399. And since we're likely to get something like a baseball half season composed entirely of small samples, don't be surprised if something like it happens again. Second, don't follow leaders uncritically. I would gladly chip in money to have a big statue of Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson erected in some prominent location. We can venerate them. That would be right. But blindly venerating them would be wrong. And with that, I've said my piece for this week.
And that ends our reissue of Infinite Inning, episode 146. Here's the closing. Appropriately, this was one of those that was done by my daughter during the time that she was forcibly home from school due to the shutdowns caused by COVID.
Hello, and welcome to the Infinite Inning End Credits podcast within a podcast. I'm Sarah Goldman, your host for the next minute plus. You can follow Brad Baluchian on Twitter at Brad Baluchian. Ask him about the Beatles. You can find Stephen Goldman at
StephenGoldman.bsky.social.
But that's not really important. What is important is that I think my college might be online in the fall. And I go to design school. You can write us at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Go to Facebook, search Infinite Inning, knock, we will let you in, and somewhere in hell, the demon Rumthelgazar, who secretly owns the place, will make another hashtag on his infernal list of the damned. Should you wish to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. And we would like to thank new supporters Duncan and Dustin. Thank you, O patrons of the arts. Finally, should you find yourself with a moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, refuse to wear it, because this is a free country. Our podcast was co-produced by Paternostro. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been hearing throughout the episode, is a co-composition of Stephen Goldman and Dr. Richard Mooring, who demands an ego boost in absence of social media, shouting, "I accomplish, therefore I am," not "I tweet, therefore I am." And then he slowly fades away.
Well, thank you, Sarah. If you have kids, you know it's always good to hear their voices, especially from a time in the cherished past. A strange time, to be sure. I'll be back with a new episode of The Infinite Inning, number 329, if memory serves me right. And if you liked this reissue, let me know, and I will continue to do them in the coming weeks. Assuming that the technical issues don't drive me... No, let's not go there. I thank you for listening to both this and all the tales from inside The Infinite Inning.